The year is 793 after Christ. On a small island off England's northeastern coast, the monks and nuns of Lindisfarne Monastery begin their day as they have for generations. Morning prayers echo through stone corridors. Scribes bend over parchment in the scriptorium. Gardens are tended with patient care. For over a century and a half, this community has stood as a beacon of Christian learning and devotion. Founded by Saint Aidan in 635, Lindisfarne represents everything the early medieval church values: scholarship, prayer, and peaceful isolation from worldly concerns. But on this June morning, dark shapes appear on the horizon. At first, the community mistakes them for merchant vessels. As the ships draw closer, however, their true nature becomes unmistakable. These are longships, sleek Norse warships with dragon-headed prows, each carrying 30 to 40 armed warriors. The monastery has no defenses, no walls, no soldiers. The monks and nuns have devoted their lives to peace, not warfare. When the Vikings storm ashore at dawn, the attack is swift and devastating. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our primary source for this event, records what followed: plunder, destruction, and bloodshed. Golden reliquaries accumulated over generations are seized. Silver chalices disappear into Viking holds. Some residents are killed. Others, particularly the young and able-bodied, are taken captive. This raid marks a turning point in European history. News of Lindisfarne's fall spreads horror throughout Christendom. Alcuin of York, one of Europe's leading scholars, writes in shock to the King of Northumbria, calling the attack unprecedented and asking whether it signals divine punishment. But Lindisfarne is only the beginning. Over the following decades, similar raids strike monasteries across Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe. To understand why, we must examine the broader context of Norse expansion. Between approximately 790 and 1066, seafaring peoples from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden dramatically expanded beyond Scandinavia. This era, known as the Viking Age, saw Norse explorers and raiders reach Russia, the Mediterranean, Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. The causes of this expansion were complex and interconnected. Scandinavia's growing population created pressure on limited farmland. Advances in shipbuilding technology enabled longer ocean voyages than ever before. Political consolidation at home drove some ambitious warriors to seek fortune abroad. And crucially, the potential for wealth through raiding offered both immediate profit and lasting prestige. Monasteries presented particularly attractive targets for several interconnected reasons. First, they were wealthy. For centuries, monasteries had received donations from kings, nobles, and common believers. They accumulated treasures: golden altar vessels, jeweled book covers, embroidered vestments, silver candlesticks. To the Norse raiders, these objects held no religious significance. They represented raw materials, metal to be melted down, jewels to be traded. Second, monasteries were typically isolated, often located along rivers or coastlines for access to water and trade routes. They stood far from military protection. Many occupied remote islands or peninsulas, chosen specifically for their separation from worldly affairs. Third, monastic communities were fundamentally peaceful. Monks and nuns had renounced violence as part of their religious vows. They possessed neither weapons nor military training. A monastery might contain extraordinary wealth yet offer almost no resistance to armed attack. This combination proved irresistible to Viking raiders seeking quick, profitable targets. The human cost of these raids extended far beyond immediate violence. Among the captives taken from Lindisfarne in similar attacks were consecrated religious monks, nuns, and priests whose entire lives had been dedicated to Christian service. To understand their fate, we must examine the Norse institution of slavery. Viking society recognized distinct social classes. At the top stood the jarls, the noble elite. The middle consisted of carls, free farmers and craftsmen who formed society's backbone. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves, considered property rather than people. Thralls came from various sources. Some were born into slavery, children of enslaved parents. Others were criminals or debtors. But the largest source of new slaves was warfare and raiding. Captives taken in raids across Europe fed a thriving slave trade throughout Norse-controlled territories. Major trading centers like Edinburgh in Denmark and Dublin in Ireland hosted active slave markets. Here, captives from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Francia were bought and sold like livestock. A healthy young person could fetch a substantial price, representing both immediate labor and potential resale value. For the nuns of Lindisfarne and similar communities, capture meant total transformation. One day, they lived ordered lives of prayer, surrounded by familiar rituals and supportive community. The next, they were dragged aboard foreign ships, stripped of status, and thrust into a world where their language, faith, and identity meant nothing. The reality of Norse slavery was harsh and uncompromising. Thralls possessed no legal rights under Scandinavian law. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their master's discretion. Their labor, their bodies, their very existence belonged entirely to their owners. Archaeological evidence and later Norse law codes revealed the conditions enslaved people endured. Thralls performed the hardest, most unpleasant work: grinding grain, hauling water, tending livestock in harsh weather, cleaning waste. Female slaves faced additional burdens, including textile production, food preparation, and childcare. For captured nuns, women who had taken vows of chastity and dedicated themselves to God, enslavement carried particular horror. In their monastic communities, they had enjoyed respect, purpose, and spiritual equality. As thralls, they became property, vulnerable to any demand their masters made. Norse society did not view sexual access to female slaves as problematic. Later Icelandic law codes, including the GRGs, explicitly discussed relationships between free men and enslaved women, treating them as normal and legally acceptable. If a master fathered children with a slave woman, he could choose to recognize those children as free, creating incentives for exploitation. For Christian women who had vowed themselves as brides of Christ, such treatment represented not just physical violation but spiritual desecration. Everything they had built their lives around, purity, devotion, service to God, was stripped away. Yet survival required adaptation. Escape was nearly impossible. A foreign captive with different language, dress, and customs stood out immediately in rural Scandinavia. Without resources, connections, or knowledge of the terrain, successful flight was extraordinarily rare. Some evidence suggests that over time, certain captives achieved a form of integration. Genetic studies of Iceland's medieval population reveal substantial ancestry from the British Isles, particularly through maternal lines. This indicates that many women brought from Britain and Ireland during the settlement period became part of Norse families, whether as slaves, concubines, or eventually wives. The archaeological record provides glimpses into these lives. Burials from Viking-age sites show stark differences between free and enslaved individuals. Some graves contain rich goods, weapons, jewelry, elaborate clothing. Others, typically on cemetery peripheries, contain only bones, sometimes showing signs of violent death or years of hard physical labor. One of the most disturbing accounts of slavery's extremes comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who witnessed a Viking chieftain's funeral along the Volga River in 921. He described how a female slave was sacrificed to accompany her master in death, killed in ritual fashion and burned alongside his body. While this represents one specific cultural practice in one location, it demonstrates how completely enslaved lives could be controlled, even beyond death. For Christian observers, such practices confirmed their worst fears about pagan brutality. Monks who survived raids or heard reports from captives recorded these events with horror and grief. The Church faced difficult theological questions. How should communities treat nuns who returned after years of forced violation? Were they still pure in God's eyes? Most theologians concluded that women forced into such situations bore no spiritual guilt. Their purity, though physically compromised, remained intact before God. There were martyrs of a different kind, innocent victims of violence beyond their control. The memory of these raids profoundly shaped Christian Europe's self-understanding. The prayer from the fury of the Northmen, "Deliver us, O Lord," became common in liturgies across the continent. Monasteries began fortifying their buildings, constructing stone towers and defensive walls. Some communities relocated inland, carrying their sacred relics to safer locations. Paradoxically, captive Christians may have played a role in Scandinavia's eventual conversion. Enslaved monks and nuns working in Norse households sometimes introduced Christian prayers, symbols, and concepts. Archaeological finds show Christian crosses buried alongside pagan amulets in graves from before Scandinavia's official conversion, suggesting gradual religious blending. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was drawing to close. Norse rulers increasingly embraced Christianity, partly for spiritual reasons, partly for political advantage in dealing with Christian Europe. Former raiders became traders and settlers. The world that had burned Lindisfarne now built its own churches. The suffering of those captured in raids left lasting marks on both cultures. For Christian Europe, the Viking raids became a defining trauma, remembered for centuries in chronicles, sermons, and art. For Scandinavia, contact with Christian captives helped plant seeds of the faith that would eventually transform Norse society. The nuns of Lindisfarne left few direct records of their experiences. Their voices come to us filtered through others, the monks who mourned them, the legal codes that classified them as property, the genetic evidence of descendants they bore. Yet their endurance matters. In the darkest circumstances imaginable, some maintained their faith, whispered their prayers, and survived. Their stories remind us that behind every historical catastrophe stand individual human beings, whose dignity persists even when all else is stripped away. The fall of Lindisfarne marked not just a political or military event, but a profound human tragedy, one that would echo through medieval history and shape the development of both Christian and Norse civilizations for generations to come.